So welcome to Lessons in Leadership. Today we have Alex Hatchman, the Chief Executive of Napthens with us. Alex, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Alex, I guess for people who might not necessarily know who you are, it'd be really good if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and the role that you do at Napthens.
Yes, of course. So I'm the Chief Executive of Napthens. It's a law firm based largely in the northwest. It's a multidisciplinary law firm. We have offices in Lancashire, in Cumbria, and in Merseyside. We offer corporate services. We offer consumer services. So yes, it's a law firm that's got about 350 people in total, of which about 35 are partners.
Wow. So a very big role then.
For law firms, perhaps, but we'll talk about this. I've come from a background where there's hundreds of thousands of people. So sometimes when we talk about 350, it can feel a bit smaller.
Absolutely. So I guess that leads us nicely into talking a little bit about your career history. So it'd be great if you could tell our viewers and our listeners a little bit about yourself and how you've got to where you are today and the sort of journey your career has taken you on.
Right. Well, I started out, Paul, as an engineer. I joined Ford Motor Company as what was called a sponsor student. So they sponsored my degree. And so I did a gap year beforehand and placements throughout it. And I was really lucky because the placements were engineering and non-engineering, then it really gave me the opportunity to learn. I worked out in the States. While I was there, I worked in Spain while I was there. And so although I was really quite young, I got to do some things actually now I sit back and go, gosh, you were really fortunate. Although that was a fantastic experience, when I was graduating, I decided that I realized actually, Paul, that it wasn't that I was a great engineer, because I'm not. It was actually that I was really curious. And I think one of my strengths is bringing people together and solving complex problems. And because when I realized that, then consulting obviously lends itself to that. And I joined Accenture and I was there for 7 years. I worked largely in supply chain and FMCG, fast moving consumer goods, and in retail with clients like L'Oreal and Sainsbury's. I did a gap year partway through to do an MBA. And even before then, Paul, often you'll do an MBA and you'll come out, you'll have this revelation, say, I want to do this now. Well, that wasn't my case. So even before I started, I knew that there would come a point that I'd want to cross over into industry. I would want to run some large operational teams. I would want to show that I could do it. So I then stepped out of consulting and joined Tesco. And that, what a fabulous business that was when I was there. Terry Leahy was in charge. It was absolutely in sixth gear. You really learned about the customer. And then, so I felt like I got my training wheels well and truly off, joined Marks and Spencer's, led their food supply chain and logistics for 5 years. So I was quite young when I started doing that. But that was, for me, just a role I loved, because I also ended up doing an awful lot of law for different reasons, because a lot of the distribution network was outsourced. So I had some very big contracts. I then wanted to go and get some more international experience while the children were younger. So I went across to Australia, worked with a food retailer called Coles, who I think you know, and was out there for a few years, came back, started doing advisory work for a law firm where I knew one of the founders and just wanted to help for an intervening period while I was about to join a supermarket, another food retailer. And then, much to my surprise, they said, actually, come and work with us full time. So I ended up going from a business that, would have been hundreds of thousands of people to one that was 400 people. But I really had developed a love of the law. I knew how I could make that business go faster. So we scaled that business, went on a really big growth journey, and then sold that. And when we sold that, I joined Napthens Solicitors. So I guess, Paul, in summary, that makes me some kind of engineering geek turned consulting person turned retail executive turned legal chief executive, in summary.
Well, a fascinating career to go from engineering into consulting into retail, into law, and then to have sold businesses along the way, to have run mega operations. What would you say has been your personal leadership philosophy throughout that process?
I think it's something that I've recognized kind of the last 5 years. So I've always been what is classically called the servant leader. And that the servant leadership model obviously is different to the old traditional command and control model, and it turns it on its head. And it's about serving people in your business. It's about enabling them to succeed. It's about serving your clients. And it is about doing that rather than them serving you. I should say it doesn't mean being a doormat, and it doesn't mean that when I don't need to be, I can't be directive, because I will be. But it does mean that under normal conditions, that my preferences are to work collegiately and to work collaboratively. And it also means that you have to get to know people throughout your organization, because you can't work in a servant leadership way if they don't know you. So from the very first induction session that I have with everybody that comes in through the door, I talk about servant leadership, and I explain to these new recruits that my role is to serve them. They look at me a little bit funny, Paul. They do. They kind of go, okay, right, I've never heard that before. But that is the truth. I think the other things, though, to say about servant leadership is that as the world has sped up, and as leadership has needed to change from those more traditional centralized models into these agile distributed models, I think servant leadership has become even more important. So I think it is worth bearing in mind that there's obviously different leadership. We say is situational. I think right now, servant leadership is absolutely in its moment. But I would say to all of those servant leaders out there, and I'm very lucky that the chairman of the business I work for, I would say he is a servant leader. But one of the things to watch out for is that you can get burnt out, because what you're effectively doing is you're putting everybody else's needs ahead of yours. And if you don't remember that you have needs too, then you can sit back at the end of the working week and go, how did I get through that? And actually, the most important thing, obviously, as a leader on top of that, is to be present. So I would say to those out there who are servant leaders, just make sure you look after yourselves too.
And how do you go about doing that for yourself? So we've had various different leaders on this show over the last 2 or 3 years who've talked about this, and they've all got slightly different takes on it. So it'd be really fascinating to find about how you go about managing that relationship with yourself so that you can be a better leader.
It's a really good question. I'm not going to sit here and pretend, Paul, I'm great at it. I've got better at it. I have a coach. I have a really good group of people who I can turn to in difficult situations too, so that I've got that ability to solve problems with people outside of the organization that I'm in. I have to say I'm very lucky. I've got a great home setup, because I personally don't think that I could cope if I was giving my all to my role, and then at home I had this situation where I was super busy all the time at home. So I've got a very supportive husband. I've got 2 great children. I've got 2 slightly out of control cats, but apart from that, but I do think it's important to have that balance, and I achieve that for me by being quieter outside of work. I did at one stage just try and kind of have really busy personal and professional lives, and I realized I couldn't do it all. So I think it's recognizing that. And I think the other thing for me is that I know myself well enough now. I'm 49 now, so I've had enough time. So I've got enough self-awareness to understand what the triggers are for me. And one example that I know when I'm getting to that point where I just need to be a bit careful is, as a leader, your job is to be with your people. And when I'm getting to the point where I'm slightly tired, I will kind of go and sit in a quiet office by myself. And I will sit there and I'll carry on doing what I need to do. And then I'll suddenly go, okay, all right. All right, you're getting to that point. And at that point, Paul, what I do is I surround myself by people who are really talented. I then delegate work out and say, this is what we have to solve together. And I go through in that way. But it's your career is a marathon, isn't it? It's not a sprint. It is absolutely a marathon. But through that marathon, there are moments where you have to push through, and there are moments where you need people on the sidelines just kind of encouraging you along the road. So I'm very lucky in many ways, but I do definitely push it too.
Absolutely, and I think it's really interesting to see that you know and understand your trigger points. I think I'm slightly younger. I'm 43, but I've learned those trigger points in myself as well. And I know that if I'm suddenly tired and overwhelmed, I need to go, probably similar to yourself, and sit in a quiet room and just have some time alone to think without any of the connected mobile devices, and just think through an issue and then come back more energized to deal with it.
Yeah, I agree.
So what's your experience of leading transformational change within organizations, and how have you gone about doing it?
It's a really interesting question for me, because I've effectively spent my whole career doing that. Whichever role I've been in, I've wanted to go in and I've wanted to not just make it a little bit better, I've wanted to go make it a lot better. And obviously in consulting, you do that. That is part of the job. But then I've done it in corporates and I've done it in SMEs. And there are some things, Paul, that are really similar, but I think there are some things that are different. So an example of similarities would be that, if you have individuals that are really great at change and transformation, they can absolutely act as accelerants. So, you absolutely need that skill set, whether you're a small business or a large business. One of the things that you do find, though, in SMEs is that they don't tend to have those skills. So bringing them on board is critical. Other similarities are you need to ensure that what you're doing strategically is right. It's got to be right strategically. It's got to be right financially. It's got to be right operationally. It's got to be right organizationally. So that is a commonality. You need to ensure that you've planned it properly to ensure that the chances of success on implementation are the highest they can be. There are complex implementations now. I think the complexity associated with it has got bigger and bigger. I do remember back to kind of late 90s where we were doing all the Y2K stuff. Those are really quite complex projects. You remember those too?
I do, yes.
But those, what we were doing in those situations was putting in place big ERP solutions, because we weren't sure what was going to happen, and kind of at midnight in 1999. So there was that side of things, but some of the change programs now are genuinely enormous. So you have to plan those. And what you can't have is a Bechet or a Terminal 5 type situation. I think, the other thing is that you've got to remember is ultimately a hearts and minds game. And you will always have the early adopters. You will always have that middle hump. And then you will always have the laggards. And no matter what you do with some of those, they will always be laggards. And I think when I was younger, Paul, I would kind of say, well, hang on, I've done all of this. I don't understand why you're not coming on the journey. You don't think. Now I've just got a bit wiser to this. I do quite a lot of, I do enjoy psychology. And so I will look through the people that I'm working with and try and understand what their preferences are from a Myers-Briggs point of view. Are they an N? Are they an S? And just try and understand why they are objecting to some of the change. So I think I've become much wiser in that, but nonetheless, there will always be, and I think it's a good thing to recognize that there will always be a few people that are going to be the laggard at the end. So I think that's one of the things that's similar. Differences, I mentioned one of those earlier about SMEs not necessarily having access to a lot of change and transformation skills. But one of the advantages in SMEs is that decision making can be really quick. You obviously don't have as many layers, you don't have as many stakeholders, so you can, in the best case scenario, make a decision and go. The only thing then is, if you don't have an organization that knows how to change, they don't have that in their DNA, then I would absolutely say before you go through that change journey, you have to do all the foundations. You have to ensure, when you start using language like PMs and BAs, businesses will say, what's a PM? What's a project manager? What's a business analyst? And obviously to corporate, that's very standard language. In smaller businesses, they won't understand that language. They won't understand even the skill set. So as an example, in my current business, when I started, we didn't have those roles within the business. And actually what it meant was that we had lawyers, sometimes partners, who were trying to do the role of a project manager. Now,
I'm sure they would argue they could do it very well and technically very, very detailed.
you know what, Paul? But they weren't. I remember meeting with a couple of partners and saying to me, I know I'm doing a project manager role. I just don't know what I'm doing. And it was that moment where that was such a helpful bit of feedback. It said, you're a fabulous partner. Let's put you into that role. Let's maximize you, but let's supplement you with somebody who does do that role. You know, you're not Prince 2 trained. You haven't got a Six Sigma black belt. So let's couple you together. And that kind of that diversity of skills is really important. So I think that is one of the things. And then the last thing I would say, maybe, Paul, is that in SMEs you can, and I'm sure you've come across this, you come across those founders that they've grown a business amazingly, but they've done it through instinct. And they've learned that their instinct is always right. And the problem is, though, the world has been changing. And their instinct might be right, but it might not be anymore. And so that is the point at which you then need to start complementing instinct with data to ensure that you make the right decision together. So yeah,
the number of very successful entrepreneurs who I've met who've grown businesses, sold businesses, grown them again, who rely on gut instinct is unbelievable.
and you know, at some point, I mean, some of them are extraordinary and they have skills that I don't have, but I've also seen some of them fall foul. You know, they've used those skills that kind of got them from A to B and realized that those skills don't get them from B to C. So
absolutely. And often that's when they bring us in. So they'll say, look, I've grown the business to this degree. It's now time to put a professional leadership team in place who can take the business to the next level so that I can concentrate on the growth and the other areas and actually have a professional support team to manage the business for them.
Yeah, I think we've also seen that, or we've seen, we sell businesses too. We do the corporate law behind that. So we will have we will have quite a lot of business owners that come to us and say, I've reached my limit now. I know that my baby, which I have incubated and developed and nurtured, I've taken as far as I can take it. And now I know that somebody else has got to take it further. So yeah.
One of the challenges that faces businesses is labor shortages. And in some instances they're real, and in some instances they're not. What do you feel about labor shortages, and what do you think we can do to address this issue?
It's a very timely question. So I guess, Paul, to give it context, there's about 36 million jobs in the UK. And at the moment, we've got 1 million vacancies. So that's about 3%. And while that might not sound like a lot, it has been described as one of the worst labour shortages in our history. And again, just for context, the number of vacancies that we saw about a year ago peaked at about 1.3 million. And again, while nonetheless that is, 1 million is high, because actually when you consider that between 2001 and 2021, so kind of all the way through noughties through to just after COVID hit, the vacancy sat somewhere between 400 and 800,000. So it is a very real issue. And I think when we go out to eat in restaurants, you feel that issue. You know that they're short of team members. I have to be honest, I don't like calling it staff. That's the retailer in me. You call people colleagues or team members. But you know that they are short of colleagues and team members, and that's having an impact on their service. But it's a double whammy impact that it has on our economy, because obviously labour shortages have a direct impact upon the ability to produce goods and services, and that's a direct impact to their top line. But then the labour shortages lead to the salary inflation. And the salary inflation erodes the margin. And the erosion of margin then means that they've got less money to reinvest in their business, to grow their business. So actually, this is a very serious problem that needs to be solved. And I think as part of solving that, I think we do have to be creative, and we have to look in those pools of talent that aren't commonly looked in. And 100 years ago, Paul, women weren't considered talented. So we wouldn't have been a pool that was looked in if this had occurred then, rightly or wrongly. But now, if you think about, there's other pools that we can look in. So there's the over 50s pool, there's a single parents pool, there's those with a disability, neurodivergent. There's those that have served prison time too. That there are those that also have talent, and we shouldn't disregard that. I hired somebody who had done time about 4 or 5 years ago. One of the best hires I've made. And the list goes on, and of course women still feature on that list, not quite as prominently, but they do still feature. And maybe, Paul, if I could tell you a quick story that kind of underpins what we can do. But when I started at M&S and I was in my role, I had a team of about 50 in the centre and thousands in the field. And I remember my boss saying, look, the team in the centre are on their knees for a number of reasons. You might not want to keep very many of them. And I was probably about 34. But I said to him, look, I just want to observe. I just want to take my time. These are people. And so is there a way that we can blend the best of old and new? So what I did do is I brought in a handful of people that really kind of set the standard and with the culture that I wanted to create. But actually only 2 or 3 people left the team. It was a very small number. And that happened in 2010. In 2012, one of my team was awarded the M&S Employee of the Year. Her name was Chris Mosley. Now, Chris was an M&S lifer. She was part of the old guard, and she was over 50. And then shortly afterwards, somebody called Ali Hill, he was awarded M&S's Plan A Champion of the Year, M&S lifer, part of the old guard, over 50. And so the point I'm making there is I could have, and I do see businesses come in, or leaders come in, or private equity or venture capital come in, and they'll do the scorched earth policy, and they'll just get rid of everybody. And I think that's such a waste of talent. So I would say that although I didn't consciously do that when I was younger, it taught me so much. And so now what I try and do is I try to go in businesses and I try and say, well, is there a way to hybrid this team? Is there a way to bring in the new, take full advantage of the old and make them feel valued, and then create something that's really special? So if we do want to look in those additional talent pools, please let's not disregard the existing talent pools.
No, absolutely. And you bring an interesting point there around developing people and taking people on that journey with you. What was it you did specifically which helped change those perceptions and change the team so that it performed to, you took over when it was an underperforming team to make it a high performing team. What were the sort of things you did there to achieve that?
I think bringing in that small group of people was really important, because when you want to achieve a real transformation in terms of culture, you have to have at least a subset of people that get that. So that for me was absolutely critical. I also, for me, I created a strategy for the team. I created a vision for the team. They had very clear roles and responsibilities, things that they didn't have before. And I also, for me, because of that leadership thing that we talked about earlier, then I became one of the team. I have this, I'm known for telling really bad jokes type thing, which I won't do today. You are so lucky. But I became one of the team. And actually, when your people are in the trenches, what do they want? Do they want you out of the trenches observing them, or do they want you in there helping them get out? So I went into the trenches with them. And actually those people I've mentioned to you, in particular Chris Mosley, who I mentioned, she's still a great friend of mine, because you've gone through that journey together. And I think there is something incredibly bonding that when you look back on your career and you've gone through really tough times with people, you have that bond that that can't be broken.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And you mentioned there in talent pools looking at women in particular. And I know diversity and inclusion is a hot topic for you and for the world at the moment anyway. And I quite like the women not being talented 100 years ago. I think that's quite funny when you look at back historically, and the journey that's happened. But what do you think in reality the headwinds are now that face women in the workplace?
Yeah, they're profound, and I think, and if I come on to the headwinds in a moment, but just in terms of, let's set the scene. So every year around International Women's Day, which is the 8th of March, I will rerun a set of data, and I will look at a couple of things. I'll look at, there's 195 countries in the world. The top 50 account for 85% of the global population. And what I'll do is I'll go through and look at the leaders of those countries by gender. So I did it again this year. And of those top 50 countries, most populous countries in the world, which account for 7.9 billion, or 85%, sorry, of the 7.9 billion, there were only 2 female leaders. And they were Tanzania and Peru. So when you consider that they're also very small populations, then of the 85% of the global population that I study regularly, 84% are led by a man and 1% is led by a woman, there or thereabouts. So when I say that the challenges are profound, they are profound. And I know that some people are tiring a little bit of the subject, and I don't wish to make anyone tire of the subject. It's just because it's so important, this subject. And I think that sometimes in the discussion, the data is lost. In terms of the headwinds, Paul, we've got our current headwinds, but I think if we look at future headwinds, there's probably 3 that are really, really pertinent. One is that low-skilled jobs, which tend to be done by women, more women do them, are at the threat of disintermediation and automation. So those jobs are under threat. Now, what that does mean is that you need to retrain, you need to reskill. However, most unpaid care work of either children or parents is done by women. So the opportunity as we go forwards on things that we as a human population are going to have to do over and over and over again is to reskill and retrain. Now, if you don't have the opportunity to do that, the time to do that, then it puts you at a disadvantage. And then the third headwind, which I think we'll all recognise, is that in the UK, about the really critical subjects going forward are STEM subjects, and about 30% of the students enrolling into STEM subjects are girls. So there are headwinds right now, but there are also going to be headwinds in the future. And this is why I think we have to keep this subject fresh, interesting, relevant, important, because it is, we now do know that women are talented. So I hope, certainly a lot of the women I know are very talented. So I think it is still going to be a relevant subject, if I'm honest, for decades to come.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, increasing diversity in the workforce at a senior level as well is just as important. So we've got to make sure that we've got that diversity throughout the workforce.
Yeah, I think that's it. And it's, as you're right, for me, it's not, I know we talk about gender a lot, but it isn't just that. It is about preferences. It's about working style. It's about, it is, of course, about even physical attributes. We know that if you're a very tall man in the United States, you're much more likely to become a president than otherwise. So it is about all of those different forms of diversity that make great teams. It's like a football team. You'd never have 11 centre forwards. You have everybody playing a different role.
So talking about that, so looking at culture then of organisations, why is it, do you think, so many organisations fall into that trap of creating a toxic culture? And given that most of them don't set out to achieve that, what are some of the pitfalls and what are the signs to look out for?
It's such right now it's such a timely question because of some of the organisations that have been caught out We are talking about organisations ranging from the CBI to the Met. And I think what is most disappointing about those examples, and of course there are many others, is that those are essential for the functioning of society. So when the actual pillars of society have got a toxic culture themselves, then actually there's an awful lot of work to do. I hear the defence, Paul, that the world is changing so quickly and that people are finding it really hard to keep up, but that's not good enough. It's not sufficient, because the examples we're talking about are not about the redefinition of a norm or something from being accepted to unacceptable. We're talking about things that were never acceptable. Mm-hmm. So, so it isn't that. And I think the question then becomes, why has it been condoned? Why has it been tolerated? And I think part of the answer lies in what I call the relativity game. And what I mean by that is I have seen many people behave badly through my career. There's, those memories are popping up right now in my head, particularly the bad ones. But many of those have done it because they've witnessed somebody else behave badly, and relative to them, it's fine. Or relative to how they behaved last year and it was tolerated and condoned, it was also fine. So herein lies, I think, the first point, which is values aren't relative. They're absolute. So you either believe in respect and dignity and integrity, or you don't. It isn't situational. It is an absolute. So I think that is one of the things that we have to really be strong about, because values are the actual core of the organisation that forms its DNA, that provides a rule book, a guiding hand as to what is okay and what is not okay. And I think the other thing about values is that they're not individual, they're universal. And what I mean by that part is that I hear people say, well, fairness is a real value of mine. And when I probe, what they're actually talking about is, you have to be fair to me. But if you're being fair to somebody and that person is tolerating unfairness to somebody else, then it's not truly a value. Fairness is about an objective fairness. It's a plural thing. It's not a singular thing. So I do think that the solutions do lie within the value systems of organisations. And I think people have to remember that values aren't relative, they're absolute, and values aren't individual, that they're universal. I think the last thing to say on culture is that, some of the younger generations get a hard time. And I actually want to be contrarian here and say that they are changing things that I wish me and my generation had changed. And they are not accepting things that shouldn't be accepted. And I thank them and I applaud them.
The next question is going to come from our previous guest. So I will hand over to...
Is there something that you wish that you would have known when you were 15 years old that would have changed your career development?
Yes. I was at 15, I was really quite an idealist. And given that, I would say to myself that whilst it's important to strive to change the world, I think it's also really important to recognise the world as it is, because otherwise it can be a tough journey. I think the second part of that question, I have 2 children, one's 9, one's 11, so they're not that far away from 15. And the advice I'm giving to them now is that the most important skill isn't necessarily, yes, maths is important, English, those are important, but their most important skill to learn is how to learn. And the reason for it is that they're going to have to learn and relearn and relearn, because they're going to have to retrain and reskill throughout their career. So if I can teach them to love learning, then that for me will be the most important thing I do as a parent.